Hi, and welcome to the School Governance Network and another of our key webinars for 2019. Today, it's on the board's first responsibility, and that's hiring the head of school or principal, depending on where you are. My name is Paul Smith. I'm the founder and CEO of the Future Directors Institute. And joining me, as always, is Michael Iannini, who is a CIS consultant and MD of PD Academia. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Paul. Nice to be back on air with you.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have us together again. For any of you new to the School Governance Network, please join our LinkedIn group where we share copies of these webinars and other content from ourselves and from around the globe, which is relevant to school governance. And also our YouTube channel. Follow us at School Governance Network, where we post up these webinars, and we've got a back history of fantastic newscasts talking about the topics of the day, the news through the lens of school board governance. But without further ado, let's move through to today's topic, as I said, which is all about what do you consider, how do you go through the process of hiring the head of school. The objectives of the webinar today are for you to really understand that it's literally your number one job as a board governor. There's going to be some a debate amongst us, some discussion between Michael and myself about what's the best process, who's best for the role in terms of, are you looking for an incumbent or is it time for a change and look at a fresh perspective? Michael's going to take you through a fantastic way in which you can create the perfect profile for your head of school as you go through the interview process. And then again, what do you do once you've got someone in the school of head of school? How as a board do you continually engage with your head of school? But without further ado, Michael, over to you.
All right. When we think about the board's number one job, which is hiring a head, sometimes boards, especially boards that don't have what we're going to call institutional memory. They don't remember the last head that got hired. They don't remember that process. There's nobody around that can remind them about how it was facilitated, how they found their candidate. Sometimes they might want to gravitate towards the easy decision and see if there's somebody within the organization that can take the helm, hence the incumbent. But sometimes, because of what an organization might be going through, many might feel it's time for a change. So, let's bring it to our first debate, Paul, the incumbent versus the external hire, and just make this real. I personally believe that there's three forms of leadership. There's a transitional leadership, there's transformational, and there's supportive. A transitional leadership is really about moving from one state into another. And when I think about transitions within schools, often the school might have just gone through some change and we're transitioning now into an area where we're going to need a little bit more continuity. So, you can imagine different scenarios within a community where that might be happening. And we just want to consolidate. Or we might be in some type of transformational state. There might be something going on within our market that's driving change within the school, whether it be pedagogical or it could be really from the finance side of things. Let's make this real as well for our audience in Hong Kong. Are we contingency planning for the fact that if things were to get worse in Hong Kong based on the protests, there have been significant impacts on businesses here. And that is going to affect whether or not you're going to have fee-paying parents for private schools. Some people are already beginning to debate whether or not to move to Singapore. There is a lot of competition in Hong Kong. When we take all these factors into consideration, there is going to be some consolidation within this market around the schools. Are we prepared for that? What is it going to look like to be able to stand out amongst the other schools in terms of pedagogical changes that might be happening, or in the face of less than desired exam results that we're looking at from last year and changes we might want to make pedagogically within the school. Is an incumbent going to be the right person for that role? And then lastly is supportive. We might have, again, just had a serious change that isn't about transition, but something is going on in the community that we just need to settle down. It's not necessarily that we need change, but we need someone just to take the helm and assure everybody everything's going to be all right. Now, there's advantages or disadvantages to both the incumbent and the external hire. Paul, do you have any thoughts around or even anecdotes related to the incumbent versus the external in these cases?
Well, first, thank you, Michael. First, I think one of the things we should also point out to our viewers and friends in the UK and Europe, obviously what's coming up, or has been coming up for multiple years in terms of Brexit, and the impact it's going to have on international schools, in terms of what's happening there in terms of access. It should be really interesting. And I think my comment on this is that the way the world is right now, you could have an argument that every single head of school is transformational. There's always something going on, whether it's a macro issue that you've mentioned where an entire state is sort of being disrupted in some way, positive or negative, depending on your point of view. But then there's the activist issues, the single issue micro issues. And you could argue that every single head of school is constantly in a place of flux. And we've seen statistically, not just in the schools world, but in the corporate sector as well, that CEOs and heads, the average tenure is coming down because of that sort of transformational nature. And also, but I think my personal view is you want some anchor. So it's almost like you need the head of school to be playing multiple roles. And I think the best role is always the supportive role. That's the style of a modern leader who can rally the troops, who can get the best out of the people around them, rather than they're the sort of like the expert in change or the expert in consolidation. So that's my view, is that you need that supportive player, which could be incumbent. If they're not incumbent, then you've got to look externally, and often a fresh set of eyes, of new blood is the right way to go.
So let's take an example of a school that recently I worked with that had to choose between incumbent and external. And in many ways, the incumbent is familiar with the community, and many in the community, are quite pleased with the incumbent's performance and relationship to their children even. And for those that are disconnected from the inner workings of the school, looking in from the outside, hey, you know what, my kid's happy, staff are happy, there's no outward complaints about this person, let's not endure any change. But then, you get other people that might be more familiar with inner workings, and might be making assumptions, fair or unfair, about the incumbent, because who knows, maybe the fact that the role of the head has become available is because of some sort of circumstances that have necessitated a change. And in some cases, the incumbent can be tied to that change. And if that change is really perceived and is going to be labeled in such a negative way, that incumbent, regardless of how great a candidate they are going to be stigmatized by what had happened previously, because they might be associated with that previous regime, in which case the external hire is the only person that you can really come in with that is going to be able to assuage the feelings in the community. But you're going to have to convince those that like the incumbent that, we do need some fresh perspective at a time like this to reevaluate the way we look at our school. So that was an interesting example that I just recently worked with in a school, and an example of where the incumbent external hire really came into the decision factor. And to be honest with you, both candidates were great. But we were just taking a look at what stage of development is our school in. So just wanted to kind of give you an idea about how these leadership types can be used in terms of understanding the state of development, or what state your school might be in, and what type of leadership it needs, as well as should we be bringing somebody up through the ranks that the community is familiar with, or do we need to bring in somebody new because for whatever reason, it could be on one end of the spectrum, associated with some type of change that was not popular, or we are going to be needing a dramatic change that our community is not prepared for. So we need to bring in that skill set.
I think this is just, sorry, before you move on, Michael, sorry, this is where the uniqueness of the school system it sort of is showing a difference between the corporate sector, you know, and some of the things we've talked to try to tie those things together and the examples together is that, you know, as you say, do we bring in someone who's known to the community, or someone completely external who has no brand, no equity with the community? When in the corporate world, you might have someone who's completely new to your staff and your customer base potentially, but they are known within the industry. And again, that acts as a little bit of a trust barrier, overcoming a trust barrier. But I think schools are in a relatively unique position whereby they sometimes pick closed communities, and obviously those communities are in a constant state of flux, as well as drop off one end and come from the other end as well. So bringing in someone fresh would really be someone fresh, and that's quite a big step. Anyway, back to you.
Well, yeah, and now when we actually reflect on the success profile, and this is why I'm going to be going into depth now over the next probably 5-10 minutes, is really understanding, all right, we understand what our community is going through. We have a pretty good idea whether or not we should be looking internally or externally, or let's just really open up all of our options and see what we can get. But now, how are we going to define the criteria for which we're going to hire this person? Well, hey, let's bring it back, Paul, to something in a slide we've probably used out of like 10 webinars. This has probably made an appearance 5 times. And it's really understanding the values of our community, making them explicit, the behaviors within the community that are deemed successful. So those behaviors that we want people demonstrating that really contribute to success. But more than anything, the beliefs. And this is sort of that bridge between values and behaviors. The beliefs are the bridge that really are going to drive the actions that need to be taken. Those beliefs around student learning, parent engagement, achievement, well-being, they really can be of so many different facets. But at the end of the day, it's those beliefs that really motivate the actions or those behaviors that are being taken. And when you take the values, the beliefs, and the behaviors together, that defines success. And once we have a good idea of what success looks like within our community, let's look at the process that's going to be behind recruiting the head. Now, here's another slide that's probably been in 3 or 4, because let's be honest, the process doesn't really change. It's how you facilitate the process. You need to really understand the purpose and the values behind the hire. Then we need to put together a search committee. So we're not having a nominations committee like we would with a board, but we're going to have a search committee for our head. Next, we're not going to do such as a board matrix, which is that audit really around defining, which is sort of that skills gap, or even that SWOT analysis of the board. What we're really looking for is a success profile that's going to help guide us into understanding what does a successful head look like in our context. Next, this is a very multi-stage process. Now, hiring a board member is also multi-stage, but these are very different and distinct stages with hiring a head of school that has very different stakeholders at each stage. So that's why I want to distinguish the difference between the interview process of the board and the head. Lastly, we talk about due diligence in stage 7. Well, I mean, when we reflect on due diligence, that really goes from stage 5 through to stage 7. In stage 5, we want to collect things like background checks and ensure that we're doing some reference checking on the resume that is being given to us, especially once we go from the long list to the short list. In the interview, though, we're also going to be getting additional information that we're going to want to validate with different sources in their previous institutions. We want to, and what I will be discussing when we talk about behavioral competency interviewing, we want to basically validate the experiences that they're relating to us in the interview. And then when we get to stage 7, where we start thinking about this decision and the person we're going to hire, we're going to need to go much deeper into their background and get more of a historical perspective in terms of their interactions with previous schools, employers, background checks, health exams. There's a variety of different tools and measures you can use. Some of these are also partly driven by the local education bureaus within your countries based on being able to get a visa for those experts. So you definitely also want to background check that. So just a quick change here in terms of our 9-step method. We're changing 2 of these boxes just to emphasize, and what's really going to be discussed today, success profiling and interview stages. Steps 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 9. I'm not going to be going into too much detail today, so that's why I've specifically highlighted 3 and 6. Now, let's start to understand the role. We're getting a good idea of the values, we're having discussions around the beliefs and, ultimately the behaviors. The behaviors we're going to further surface through our success profiling. But as we start to shape this job description and the profile for the person we're going to hire, we need to really understand our relationship to them as the board or as the chair. Because let's be honest, this is going to be our only report. This is our direct report. And so we need to devise a job description that really makes that clear, that not only holds them accountable to us, but us accountable to them. And here's just a simple slide that I've taken from the National Association for Independent Schools that really just highlights these 3 roles, the board, the chair, and the head, and how their roles are different. Paul, do you have any thoughts in regards to this role relationship?
Yeah, like I had a question actually that I want something I have experienced and spoken to others about is, especially when you don't have a big formal structure and a lot of paid board roles, is one of the biggest concerns or one of the biggest problems is boundaries. What is the role of the board? Where does that intersect with the role of the head? What about relationships between board and management? So everything isn't always going through the head and the chair. Like what's best practice in terms of making sure, beyond documentation and sort of like formal and informal agreements, what's best practice in terms of making sure there's effective communication between management and board, but not everything's being whitewashed through the head or everything's having to be channeled through the head, which can be very inefficient.
Yeah, I mean, just in the last year alone, I was working with another school that had completely lost trust in their head because they felt the head was basically filtering all the information, not letting important community information get to the board. And, in this particular case, that board was getting tidbits of information through social media or other places that really left them wondering, hey, are we getting the full picture here? Which then drives them to wanting to ask questions and go around the board, go around the head. Well, first I would argue, look, you hired this person, you need to maintain a relationship with that person. And if it's a good relationship, there are no secrets. Everything is on the table. If everything's not on the table, then let's question the person you've hired, which really begins with you, the board and the chair. If that relationship starts to erode over a period of time, let's start to look at the structure and within which we're managing it. Are we having regular review of the head? Most boards, surprisingly, do not evaluate their head of school. They might expect their teachers to get evaluated or even leadership to be evaluated, but it's surprisingly how little time is spent on the board evaluating the head, let alone themselves. So if you don't have an evaluation process, you can't really address those elephants in the room that are basically, are we getting the information we need? Because I don't think we are. So let's think about an answer to this. So problem, I don't trust the head. Answer, well, hey, evaluation, number one. But number two, let's look at your subcommittee structure. If you need access to the finance manager, or you need access to marketing and admissions, or you need access to curricular coordinators or leaders, just to better understand the pedagogy and how certain debates in the community might be affecting the governance of the school, such as bilingualism. That's a huge one right now. Then let's look at using our subcommittees. And, typical subcommittee, the audit committee, or the budget or finance committee. That's the perfect opportunity where the board interacts with the CFO or the head of finance or the business manager for the school to understand the finances and accounting. Now, in that subcommittee meeting, you have the finance officer and you have the head of school sitting together. That's an opportunity for that interaction, and for them to be able to interact directly up to the board. So kind of a long and a short answer for you, Paul, would be number one, relationship and evaluation. And then number two, look at your subcommittee structure and how you can get other leaders within the school participating in governance.
Yeah, look, I think the great thing is that the subcommittee structure mitigates any sort of risk. But one of the big things, and we've talked about it beforehand, is really clear communications and clear expectation management. You do want to think about, like, one of the things I like to think about is it is one team at the top, but there are two separate entities, but they need to be working together. But again, clear boundaries are very, very critical. And that just comes down to managing expectations and potentially a bit of paperwork and protocol, and especially when you're bringing on new people. These things can evolve, but again, this is why the importance of onboarding both governors and staff members into what is expected from that point of view. So we'll carry on.
Yep. So now we have a good idea about our role to this person. It's our direct report. We're beginning to flesh out the job description and the responsibilities, specifically how they relate to our relationship. Let's go into really greater detail now. Let's do a deep dive in understanding what does success look like for this candidate in our school. And this is important to understand because there is no like for like. You can't look at a resume and say, oh yeah, that's the American school in that country, and we're an American school in this country. And I look at the website, and we got similar curriculum. So, hey, that would be a great candidate for us. No, your communities are going to be completely different, without question. Even if you're a counselor school or an embassy school for that matter, when you're in a different country serving different populations, you are serving different people and different missions. So there is no like for like with schools. So we cannot do it based on the fact that they're coming from a school that's a similar size, similar curriculum, or even like a similar, what we might deem culture just by national identity. We have to accept the fact that our school is unique. And based on its uniqueness, we have very unique job challenges or experience required to be successful at this school. So section 1. Section 2, the knowledge required to be successful at this school is incredibly important. And that knowledge could be anywhere from pedagogical to management. And this is where you're really kind of doing a deep dive again into understanding those gaps or the SWOT analysis that we would have done with a board matrix. We have a very strong finance arm within our school. We understand that part. We're really good at planning. But pedagogically, we're really starting to struggle because we didn't have strong leadership in the past. An example of what that might look like is that, we allowed division heads to basically run their own schools. So we had 3 schools within one. We had our primary, our middle, and our secondary, or your early years, or your different campuses. And so in this particular case, we need a single school. We need a one school approach. So that knowledge towards that, we need to focus more of our candidate in that regard. So the knowledge can change in different ways. Next, when we look at section 3, leadership behaviors, this is a huge cultural issue because I want to draw your attention to a study that started in the 90s and has been ongoing to this day. It's the GLOBE study, GLOBE. It started at Thunderbird and Wharton School of Business back in the 90s. It's a study that has been done over 100 and I want to say in the early days, it was over 120 countries, 68 distinct cultures that they surveyed. They went in and surveyed 1,500 companies originally that were in those cultural areas that they identified, those distinct cultures, to basically understand what is good leadership, what is effective leadership in this culture for this company. And by doing so, they got a really good understanding of how each culture defined leadership and successful leadership at that. And this did develop a theory called implicit leadership belief. And implicit leadership belief is really important because just because you're a successful leader in the United States does not mean you're going to be a successful leader in China. The teams and the people that you're going to be leading are going to have very distinct needs. And if you do not understand them, do not tailor your leadership approach to them, you will not be successful. Hence the reason why schools are never going to be the same. So leadership behaviors. What leadership behaviors are successful for our school? And lastly, personal style. We need to understand what is the personal style that people are going to really gravitate towards, that are going to really reassure them and make them feel comfortable. You know, we talked about transformation, and I know you started to elaborate on it, Paul. If we're looking at some sort of transformation, like for instance, a very common argument for schools historically were about school uniforms, wanting to go from a no school uniform sort of open dress policy to having a school uniform. Well, what type of personal style do we need from the head to help support that and to reinforce it? It could be just that simple. Or it could be other types of personal style when we look at the 3 types of leadership: transitional, transformational, or supportive. Those are 3 very different personal styles. So I just want to give you a quick example of what a success profile looks like then. And here what we have is our success profile for a head of school based on each one of those sections: job challenges, knowledge, leadership, and personal style. Paul, I've kind of thrown this out there. You know, what are your thoughts around it? Any questions that you think might need to be addressed at this stage?
Look, I think these success profiles are wonderful sort of templates for exactly who you're looking for, and it covers off so many different things. I'm really interested to learn how do you really build one effectively. It'd be very easy for the search committee, the committee we've mentioned, just to basically take this up on themselves and say, right, this is what we believe. So, but to do this effectively, how would you build a success profile?
So when I do this with schools, and I do this for a number of positions within a school, not just boards, as you're familiar with, but also with the head of school or even other, I would say the success profiling, you could even do it to the level of a teacher. You know, when we think about the different subjects and grade levels for a teacher, it could be, you know, quite onerous. So it really depends on how far a school wants to go with this. But so the process for this and why it would be onerous is that it's really a 360-degree interview process about that position, about that role. And what we're really trying to understand is people's experience with that role in that school, and trying to surface the key attributes that are going to contribute to a person's success. So in this moment in time, in this particular window, what are the challenges that we're facing and the experience we need to overcome them? What is the knowledge this person needs to bring to the school? What is the capacity we want them to build? This is actually a term that's very, I would say, unknown in education, and that's the term of capacity building. And that's basically really developing skills and knowledge in an area so that we can be, you know, not just more successful, but effective in some regard. So, hey, we might pedagogically be very strong, but management-wise, we're very weak. We need somebody that understands organization and structure. So therefore, we're going to bring in a head that has greater knowledge around organization and structure, and we're going to put a little less weight on the pedagogical side because we're really happy with our principals. Let's take a look at the leadership behaviors. Implicit leadership belief. I got loads of activities around really surfacing the types of attributes around leadership for a full community that helps us understand what is that community looking for in a leader. And those expectations do change over time. So as we go from one head recruitment process to the next, we could expect change in all of these categories. Specifically though, when you take a look at leadership behaviors too, we need to align them with the values we've identified for this candidate. So we're looking for alignment in terms of the values aspect of our community and the beliefs that drive what we do. And we're looking to find a way to infuse and align that through this process. So the ones that really stand out are going to be the ones that we've highlighted from the beginning as well. Personal style. Again, based on what our community needs right now, how do we want this this head of school to behave, and what sort of demonstrations are we looking for them when they interact with the community? All of this, by the way, when you conduct this type of interview process, is very validating of the way that we perceive our community through our guiding statements, our vision and mission. Now, if for whatever reason we go into this process and the information we collect contradicts our guiding statements, well, that's pretty telling as well. But that's a whole nother webinar.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think, so I've got a couple of follow-up questions. I don't want to dwell too long because I know we've got a lot to get through. But, one of the things I like about the 360 when you're hiring such a core part of the team is just how much you get when people feel like they've got, they're invested in the process across the school community. So it's not just about a few people deciding on and then suddenly, surprise, here's your new head of school, which is often what happens. I think what I like about this process is that you can actually go relatively deep into the school and go, like, what are we all looking for? And then try and find those common traits. How deep do you go in this, potentially in this 360 process, whereby you might get way too many views and no consensus? Like, how far do you go? Do you talk to, do you want parents to have an input, or is their input in terms of the building of the values at the front end of the school? Is it really just the staff and board, or where else would you go?
Let's take a look at the average size of an independent school.
Sorry, Michael. I want to say as well, that's probably a whole new webinar as well, by the way. But let's see how we can do it in just a few minutes.
I mean, really, my 2-minute answer to that one is simple. Let's take a look at the average size of an international school. Let's put it around 800 or so, right? Single campus, and potentially 900. I can't remember the numbers, and regionally it's going to change, but based on that, what I would say is you could actually do a success profile 360 with as few as 13 people. But what you're looking for is you're looking for somebody that can represent the views of the board. And when that person knows they're entering into this success profiling interview, they themselves are collecting information from their peers just to better understand what they might deem as success. So there is some preparation in the interview process to help them understand what they're going to be engaging in. So you get board, you get management, you get parents, you get students, you get staff. Then we can be looking at different divisions within the school, primary, middle, and secondary. If you have different streams, you could be having the different streams contribute a person. It's really just trying to understand the demographics of your school and try to identify who can be representative of each cluster and have them participate in the process, but prepare them in such a way that they can fairly represent the cluster. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Perfectly. Thank you. I love that representation side of things. Anyway, let's move on. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. So like, yeah, I mean, and again, a perfect example, and there's probably so many more questions around success profiling because it is an incredibly complex process. And it has to be facilitated very effectively, because the last thing you want to do is engage in a 360 interview where you have very biased or leading questioning. So you have to be very careful in this process, and there's a lot of research that goes into it and a lot of preparation as well. But what this leads to is my next sort of tool for hiring ahead of school is competency-based behavioral interviewing. Now, it's interesting, as a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant, I track a lot of what's going on within the council, and you see at all their search fairs, they do workshops on competency-based behavioral interviewing. And it's something that only in the last few years schools have really started to understand, but in practice, very few of them really do it well. Or even do it at all, even though they're being introduced to it. Competency-based interviewing really flows from the success profile, because now we're going to be targeting competencies that are attributed to success. We're going to define those competencies in terms of what they look like within our community. So here's one for learning, teaching, and curriculum, and our competency definition. And because this is a behavioral interview, what we're looking for is, take this question, for example: describe a time when you had to implement curricular changes when you had a limited knowledge of that curriculum. So we're really keying in a very specific situation that might be deemed critical, that was surfaced through our success profiling process. And we want to understand that within this context, number one, there's the competency, implementing curricular changes. But two, here's the twist, the behavioral aspect: you have limited knowledge based on what's going on. And this could be very true of a head of school that's coming from a secondary school, but we as a school within our current context are undergoing, maybe implementing, maybe we want to be full continuum, and we're starting to put in place the PYP and the MYP. Well, if you're not familiar with those, how can you help us lead that process? That's what this competency-based behavioral interviewing tool, that's how it marries the two. That's how it marries the experience with the behavior. And then I already discussed with you the fact that the due diligence is a process throughout. Well, now that we have a very specific example of how this person has described to us how they were successful in a past instance, now when we actually do a reference check, we have something specifically to reference. Were they successful in that instance? People that do the reference checks too early miss out on that opportunity. People that don't actually surface this type of relevant behavioral experience miss out on that opportunity to validate it. But now, your behavioral interviewing is really limited. You can only have, I'd say, within an hour and a half, maybe a few questions, and especially because our interview process is going to include a panel, what I would say of anywhere, I would say 3 to 5 people maximum, and each person's going to have a different role within this interviewing process. And I'm not going into too much detail about how you structure your panel, but I do want to emphasize the fact that within an hour and a half, you can probably only do 3 behavioral interview questions, because the beginning of the interview is going to be structured around just validating information that we know, introducing them. Well, let's take it back one more step. Introducing them to the process if it's the first interview, validating information from their resume, enabling them to ask a few clarifying questions about the process so we can build rapport and get them comfortable. Moving into a couple easy behavioral competency questions just to get a good understanding of around certain aspects of their experience. And when we think about, there's going to be about 2 or 3 stages of behavioral interviewing. The first stage, maybe we only have, I don't know, a parent, a curriculum coordinator, a teacher, or a deputy doing the first one at a lower level. And so their interests are going to be different. So the behavioral questions they choose are going to be more focused around their needs and things they can validate through what we have, our anchors or our rubric at the bottom of this form here. And we also give them additional probes they can use to help them guide that questioning, because let's just accept the fact that a lot of people in our schools are not professionals when it comes to asking questions or doing inquiry, or leading inquiry. As hard as that is for me to say about educators, that's not their strong suit. They guide learning, but when it comes to inquiry and interviewing, they're going to struggle, especially with somebody that might be their boss. That, not just a cultural context, but from an experience context. So let's keep them within their comfort zone. And then when they actually rate that person, we're going to use anchors that they're familiar with. In our second interview, you might use behavioral competency questions that focus more on leadership and management, because now we have principals involved, board members, or the business manager. If we move to a third level, it might just be the board chair and other relevant senior stakeholders that are facilitating that process. So that's kind of marrying two parts of the interviewing process. Number one, the importance of competency-based behavioral interviewing, but number two, how you can spread it out across multiple interviews. Any thoughts about that, Paul, before we move forward?
Just listening to this, and as someone who's recruited both board directors and senior management CEOs as part of the board, it's easy to go, oh, this looks like a lot of hard work, especially if it's not second nature to you, or not a strength of the group. My only words of counsel will be going back to your number one point about the webinar objective. This is the number one most important role of the board, and so you've got to treat it with respect, and that means doing your preparation. Because if you think about the role of the board, which is sort of strategy development, risk management, as well as the financial side of things and the stakeholder reporting and management, if you think about the risk of getting it wrong, as opposed to the opportunity of getting it right, and combined with the opportunity of getting it right, doing this preparation, really getting this process and this structure and this stage right, as opposed to just turn up to the interview underprepared and have a free-ranging, bog standard, non-probing interview, you could end up with completely the wrong candidate who is really good at interviewing, but not a great leader. And again, I think both of us would say that putting the effort in now will pay dividends later on. Like pretty much anything in life, if you put the effort in now, it will pay dividends later on.
Yeah.
So it's really about having respect for your role as the board of governors.
Yeah, and just think about how involved this process is. This to hire a head these days, to hire a good head appropriate for a school, could take 2 years minimum. And I say minimum, right? To find the right head, I've seen schools go without a head now. There's some schools here that have not had a head for quite a few years. Because they just can't find the right one, and they allow their management and their principals to effectively run the school through a senior leadership team. Is that the most effective way? No. Is it working? Yes. Because let's admit it, the most appropriate and most important hire is going to be this person. So let's make sure it's right. Moving on, now we have identified some candidates we feel are right, and I would say the campus visit is a way to really to continue to get buy-in to this process and include the whole community, because this is going to be our leader of the community. So the campus visit is a very important part. It also can be a very expensive part, because this is where we're flying out the candidates to our schools. If they have a family, I recommend you fly their family as well, so the family can get acquainted to the school. And so we're looking at 2 to 3 candidates that we're going to bring out for a campus visit. And so not only are you spending a lot of time, now you're going to be spending a lot more money. Not only hiring, search companies, probably having a professional facilitator, now engaging in the process of flying out families to visit the school, and spending what could be 1 to 3 days with this candidate. You're going to have to make sure it's scripted very well and planned very well. What I have here for you is just a simple half-day agenda taken out of a 2-day agenda for a school that I worked with. And when we take a look at it, this half-day agenda was really focusing on the kindergarten or the early years section. In this particular area, what we're looking at is, At lunchtime, the candidates would have lunch with the kindergarten. So let's just see how they behave with the kids. You know, in an unscripted environment, having lunch. Are they comfortable? Are they interacting, playing with the kids, and is it appropriate in terms of the ways well that they communicate with the kids? Student panel. Let's bring some kids in and have a bit of a town hall facilitated by one of the teachers. This is great because you're satisfying two stakeholder needs. The student and that teacher as a facilitator is also an interviewer. And so you can look at the different themes for each one. There's a program tour, a middle years tour, a middle leaders meeting, a board dinner. Now, the most important thing about this campus visit is each meeting has a guiding question or a theme. This is incredibly important, that before you have these stakeholders meet with your candidate, they need to agree on what they're meeting about. What is the driving question they have about this candidate that they can evaluate them on? Can this candidate address their need? And that's in the form of an inquiry, of a question. And this question is also made known to the candidate. So they know what they're coming in, because their time is limited. It could be 45 minutes to an hour. We don't want them to have to try to understand that question in that meeting. We want them coming in prepared to answer it and be able to allow those that are interviewing them to probe and go deeper. That takes time. So both sides need to be prepared. Hence the reason why I think a question is a great way to do this. Through that interviewing process as well, we know we have 2 to 3 candidates. So each candidate as well cannot just have an unscripted interview. Each interview has to be like for like. So therefore, the evaluative criteria for each interview needs to be the same. Lastly, let's take a look at the opportunity that additional participants or chaperones can play in this. Well, as we go from the cafeteria to the library, from the lunch with kindergarten into the student panel, there could be somebody for a 30-minute period that takes the candidate to a break room, the restroom, maybe just sits with them and has a coffee afterwards. That could be unscripted, but an opportunity for another member of the community to basically present themselves as a friend, as a host or hostess, somebody that's welcoming, because this isn't just about us interviewing them. They're interviewing us. I've worked with a number of schools where we have identified great candidates, and the candidates after the campus visit turned down the offer. That says something about the way the campus visit can also have an effect on the candidate's perception of the school they're walking into. In one particular case, it was just the fact that when the candidate got there, it just wasn't the right school or environment for their family, which was understandable. And we wouldn't have known that if the family didn't come. And interestingly enough, there was a school, I almost said where it was, a school that I worked with in terms of its strategy and leadership. I was really surprised. In one year, I'm working with this head of school because they've joined it. We're beginning the strategic planning process. The next year, when I'm following up to begin the evaluative measures of them, that head of school has left. Unbeknownst to me, I've walked into the school cold. I asked them why, and basically because, the wife and the children weren't happy. And it just, blew my mind. How did you not know you were not going to be happy coming into probably one of the most important roles you can serve? Both parties are responsible for that. So I've gone into great detail on this. Paul, any sort of ideas or questions around this area that I might need to clarify?
No, not at all. Carry on.
All right. So, hey, now it's time to close out. And as always, we want to close out with some tips for you. First set of tips are about community engagement. Form a search committee. Make sure that search committee is representative of your community that can really help you understand the parameters for which you're going to be hiring, understanding those values. People that can also help in terms of facilitating the success profiling process. The search committee themselves would not participate in it, but they can help identify the people that will. Communications planning. Before we begin a search, do not enter it not knowing what you're going to communicate at each stage. Plan your communications from day 1 all the way through to 2 years. Make sure you understand each stage of the recruitment process and what and when it needs to be communicated. communicating things ad hoc or as a reaction to people asking you, hey, what's going on, it creates mistrust and it undermines the recruitment process. It's what makes people start saying, oh, this is just their friend. They're bringing in somebody they wanted. This is all a ruse. Why are we even participating? I hear that so much because there was bad communication planning. You know, second process, interviews. As you move from the search committee into the interviewing process, a very important part about community engagement as well is the fact that you're going to be getting resumes in from, you know, whatever the sources you choose to use. You're going to have a long list. People need to go through that long list. Why don't we use students, teachers, you know, middle leaders in the school to help us sort through the long list? Give them the opportunity to go through 100 or 500 resumes, start to sort them out, work with the search committee to identify the short list. Then once we identify the short list, we can begin moving through the interview cycle. And obviously that interview cycle starts with success profiling and ends with our multi-stakeholder interviews and our campus visit. The most important part of this process, though, is number 6, data. You're constantly collecting data and clarifying what is confidential, because throughout this process where we're asking people for information, we need to let them know how it's going to be used and what they're going to have access to. So the success profiling begins the collection of data from our community, and it ends with the evaluations we do through the interview process and the campus visit. For instance, data and confidentiality. We have to keep in mind that many of these candidates are coming not knowing that they're going to be taking on a new job role. And so they don't want their reputations being in any way any sort of conflicts or any sort of negative perceptions being raised about them through social media or people searching for information that aren't part of the search process. So throughout this process, we need to maintain the identity and the personal information of our candidates as confidentially as possible. Now, once they get into the campus visit, we have to expect the fact that, yes, now our candidates are known. Now the community is going to be fully invested in wanting to find out more about them. So we need to tell our community about how important it is to respect the privacy of these candidates and not to do their own investigations, because that could damage their relationships with people back in their communities or potentially other schools they're looking at joining. So confidentiality is key. When we ask our community to take surveys or evaluations or submit evaluations of the candidates that they're interviewing, we need to keep those evaluations confidential and private. We cannot share that publicly because, again, some people may not agree with the decision. We need to have trust in the people that are moderating the process. For those that do not trust it, they're going to have their reasons for not trusting it. We're going to have to engage dialogue with them, but we do not want them using data to undermine the process and for their own purposes. Or, you know, what's worse is that they go out and ruin the reputation of somebody that engaged in this process for which we're evaluating them. Because it's going to be out of context. So again, confidentiality and privacy, incredibly important, but you need data throughout so that you can actually validate the decisions you're making. And, you know, I talked about this campus visit, you know, get everyone involved, have separate interviews, use it as best you can to make sure that it's the perfect marriage of the candidate and the community, and continually evaluate the process, collect the information at each stage, make sure the information you're collecting is like for like. So the setup of your survey and evaluation system throughout the process, not just for the individual candidates, but at the end, some sort of summative evaluation as well of all the candidates. And determine what you want to disclose at the beginning and what's going to be confidential at the end. And Paul, for the most part, those are my top 10 tips for this recruitment process. And I think everything that I touched on in our webinar.
Yeah, where's number 10? You've got number 10? Is there a 10 there? I know you've got a number 10. There's the confidential. Yeah, making the offer itself again. And we didn't touch too much on that, but again, people know, I'm sure people know that sort of thing generally. Yeah, look, again, it's a very comprehensive process. And again, for those listening in to this webinar. You know, I go back to the previous point we both made in terms of, you know, doing the preparation, putting in the work, going through a clear process, and having patience with that process. You know, what you're aiming for is the best possible candidate, and this is the most critical role the board goes through. And hopefully, as a board, you may only go through it once, and that's why it's so important to do.
Yeah, I think I kind of needed a break in terms of my my lecture there, because my throat was getting a little dry. But let me just touch on number 10 really quickly on the offer.
We both have a affinity for monologuing, so it's great. I think anybody who watches our webinars now, you know, and thank you for sticking with us through this one, understands they're getting a lot of great content for nothing, rather than just spending a bit of time with us. So again, we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we like to give comprehensive information out.
No, it's true. Yeah, but the offer, I put a note down here about it's conditional. We give an offer of employment to the candidate. It's up to them to accept it, but it's also up to some conditions, because once we've accepted them, there's going to be some additional conditions we might have that they're going to have to submit to us. That might have been, you know, that might have been too onerous throughout the process, might have been costly in terms of, say, medical examinations, the ability to get an approval for them to be our head of school within the country that we're at. Maybe we're going to look at financial statements, because we want to make sure that, you know, they're financially healthy, that they're not in bankruptcy, that there's no pending court cases against them. I mean, there's a myriad of examples that why this needs to be conditional, and why when you actually formulate your offer, you need to capture that as best as possible, so that both you and the candidate realize that, hey, we want to work with each other, but there's just a few things more that we have to do to get across, so that we make sure that, you know, this is a long-term relationship that's not going to be compromised by anything we didn't check on going into it. And that's the top 10. And our summary of what we covered today is, hey, we looked at the who, the what, the how, and the when. And, you know, I'd be happy to answer any questions for you. So when you look at this video, feel free to post those questions in the comments section from our YouTube channel, or even in LinkedIn. I hope you find us in LinkedIn, because that's where actually I address a lot of different governors' questions. Paul as well submits a lot of content there through what he's writing and reading about. Really can't wait till we start talking about board technology, Paul.
I know. Yeah, I know, that's a favorite one coming up. Well, look, thank you, Michael, for another wonderful webinar. As Michael said, don't forget to check out the LinkedIn group if you haven't already, if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're viewing this via the LinkedIn group or another means through our email list or whatever it happens to be, then don't forget to check out our YouTube channel with a back catalogue of similarly valuable content and webinars, and some shorter ones as well as some longer ones as well, but always fully comprehensive. Michael, thank you again for expert commentary, and thank you everybody for listening.